CALED's podcast series shares information to help economic development professionals and communities of all sizes build resilient, sustainable economies through effective economic development policies and initiatives.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to CALED's podcast on helping businesses plan for and recover from economic disruptions. I'm Helen Schaubmayer, Program Manager with CALED, and I'd like to welcome our expert speakers today, Colette Curtis, who is Recovery and Economic Development Director in the town of Paradise, and Jesse Torres, Principal of ArroyoWest. Welcome, and thanks to both of you for joining us today.
Thank you, Helen.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Colette and Jesse both contributed to the Economic Development, Recovery, and Resiliency Playbook, and today we'll share some of the insight they provided in that resource. At the end of the podcast, we'll provide a link where you can download a copy of the entire playbook. First off, I'd like to ask both of you to please talk briefly about your experience with economic disruptions and disasters. Why don't we start with you, Colette?
Great. Thanks, Helen. Well, again, my name is Colette Curtis. I'm the Recovery and Economic Development Director for the town of Paradise. I've worked for the town of Paradise for 10 years, and in that time have experienced my share of economic disruptions due to disaster, unfortunately. We've had a number of fires and other natural disasters, including a near dam failure nearby. But of course, the most impactful disaster that we have experienced here in Paradise was the Camp Fire in 2018. That caused quite a bit of disruption to our entire community, including our business community.
Jesse.
Yeah, first, just it's so great to be on this same podcast with Colette and, the city of Paradise, just amazing work that was done on recovery on there. So just want to give you a shout out, Colette, to you and the team, because I know you guys put in a ton of work into that. So again, Jesse Torres, Principal for ArroyoWest. It's interesting, whenever I think of disaster, I actually think about my own first personal experience with disaster when I was a high school senior in the San Fernando Valley, and I woke up early one morning, very early, to my bed shaking, and it felt like the whole house was going to collapse because of the Northridge earthquake, and my high school collapsing as a result of that earthquake, which forced us to move to a different location the remainder of the year, and that's how I finished out my high school. So I don't get high school reunions the way everybody else does because our high school no longer exists. So that was my first real experience with disaster and kind of seeing the impact of that. Especially my dad was a small business owner, and I remember he had a barbershop and all of his glass windows shattering, and just the cost of repair and the headache of having to fix that was a big deal. Flash forward many years later, I was the small business advocate for Governor Brown, served the governor's office of business economic development, and my last 2 years there, I got really involved in disaster work because of the firestorms up in Northern California, Santa Rosa first, and then it kind of spread down to Southern California, major fires followed by major flooding. And I was the one in charge of helping to drive small business recovery for the governor's office. Back then, it was really kind of undefined as far as who would really kind of be the point person for small business work. And because I was a small business advocate, they all turned to me and said, Jesse will do it. So so that's how I got my real feet into disaster work, and that's continued on into my professional career, helping out with pandemic and other fires. But yeah, I'll stop there.
Wow. That's so interesting, Jesse. You actually, my very first disaster, which I didn't even think about, was the 1989 Bay Area earthquake. I was 9 years old.
Wow. Yeah.
So
100%.
Similar experience.
Yeah, I experienced the earthquake situation as well in Southern California. It's scary stuff, and personally it impacts you, but businesses are greatly impacted, and that leads to our next question. How is the impact to businesses after disaster different from what happens to the community as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to take a stab at that, Colette. So, it's so interesting, and I would say pandemic really kind of shifted a lot of that kind of, perspective, because I think for a long time, at least when I did the research for my portion of the playbook, a lot of folks look to businesses to create the new normal, that return to it, what people experience as far as rapid recovery. But what we saw essentially in like the pandemic is like, oh, those businesses are going through the same trauma as everybody else. And the impact can sometimes even be more devastating because these folks that you rely on for normalcy now themselves are in a place of really, strong distress. So I would say that, for the businesses, it's kind of twofold, especially since, the majority of small business owners, and this is me being the small business advocate, more than 90% of small businesses in the state of California, which has the most small businesses of the United States, most of them are sole proprietors. They don't have employees or they're running a business out of their own house. And so they're going through two things at once. One, the personal impact of a disaster, and then also having to manage their business at the same time. So for them, you're having to deal with both worlds at the same time. Then also you have the pressure of the community looking to you for that sense of normalcy, because the faster you get back up, the faster you're able to provide coffee or food, the more they feel at ease. And when that doesn't happen quickly, it can cause some major issues. So that's my perspective. But Colette, would love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, I think you make some excellent points there, Jesse. In the time after a disaster, those small businesses especially are not only dealing with the impacts to their businesses, but also their personal lives, like you said. And we really found that what that meant is that they first were dealing with their personal issues. So for example, in the Camp Fire, many of our business owners lost their homes and their businesses. That is a devastating blow to anyone. And so, of course, first they're going to deal with their home, and then they're going to look to their business. And so what that has meant is that businesses returning to Paradise after the Camp Fire has taken a lot longer than residences returning, which isn't always the model as you're working with your state and national partners in recovery. And so you really have to look at that and think, where can businesses and where can your local jurisdiction, where can your local economic developers come in to fill those gaps and help move that recovery along? We really felt that was a gap, and understandably so. It's very complicated when you have that much loss and trying to come back from that.
Yeah, definitely. Good point. Well, Colette, how does infrastructure or lack thereof impact the ability of businesses to rebound after a disaster?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite topics when it comes to recovery after a disaster for businesses. And I think it's because it's not always the first thought when you're thinking about a business coming back. But what we found, not only in the Camp Fire, but in other disasters that we have experienced here, is that you really can't think about economic recovery until you have basic infrastructure met. And anytime you have a really large scale disaster, you're going to have those types of impacts. You're going to have roads that are impacted. You may have, power disruptions. You may have internet disruptions. That type of thing hampers any type of business recovery, and you have to address those things first. And so what I talk about quite a bit in the chapter in the playbook is just that, and how an economic developer, whether you are in a city or a county or outside of that, how you can work with the local public works or capital projects to kind of think about that before a disaster, as well as during and after a disaster, because there are actions you can take at all points to make that recovery a little bit better.
What specific ways can an economic developer can prepare or even improve existing infrastructure to help mitigate these impacts?
Right. One of the best ways is to start a relationship with your local public works capital project team. That's easier if are within the city already, but anyone can do that and start that relationship and just start a discussion about what is that infrastructure that is vital not only to residents but to those businesses, where in the case of a disaster that needs to be looked at right away. From my perspective in Paradise, one of the things that we did was we had a strong inventory with our facilities and roadways that we actually luckily had prior to the Camp Fire. That went a long way when we went to seek assistance after the fire to restore those roadways. Having that inventory ahead of time put us miles ahead of where we would have been without it. And so that's one of those things that if you think about it ahead of time, you really can get ahead of that in recovery. And afterwards, working with that team, with the Public Works or capital projects team, to identify those projects that have a nexus between, of course, capital projects, public works, what a city is really interested in, but also what will help with that economic recovery, because there is a lot of help available out there through many different sources. And many of that has a nexus with economic recovery. And so being able to tie those things together can be really helpful and can strengthen applications. If you're applying for funding, if you can show recovery across a wide array of areas, including economic recovery, it can really strengthen an application. We have had many projects that have been sort of dual projects where we say, well, this is a capital project, it's also an economic recovery project. And being able to put that into context has helped us gain support legislatively and through the agencies who are making those funding decisions.
Really good tips and really good information for communities to consider in their resiliency efforts and preparing for economic disruptions. Thanks, Colette. All right, moving on. So what is the economic developer's role in helping businesses after a disaster or economic disruption?
Yeah, happy to jump into, and also just on the infrastructure piece, I think your lessons that you learned there, Colette, are really important. It'd be fascinating to see if there was any kind of way to share those practices or those lessons learned across the state, because I remember the last time I had to deal with the major fire in the Santa Barbara area, there was a debris flow that blocked the freeway, Highway 101. And I don't know if they've done since the study around, like, what do we do next time when the freeway gets cut off? Or what are those roads that then can actually have people, I remember they had issues with food getting there, because the trucks weren't able to get through. And, there's just so many lessons learned. I wonder if there's an opportunity such around infrastructure that can be shared with others. But, Helen, to your question around, what is the role of the economic developer? I remember, being the one best positioned to convene first and foremost, where you have the ability, especially if you're not in the impacted area, the ability to kind of have a larger view of what's going on and what assets might be needed to bring to bear, or at the very least, because you're not necessarily in the weeds of trying to address, physical safety, personal safety, that you can be the best one to convene a meeting to try to aggregate resources and essentially do work for those who are directly being impacted at the moment. So I always think of that's one of the first things the economic developer can do is kind of be that main convener, the information provider, do the things that the others may not have time to do because they're working on physical safety, immersing on personal safety, those kinds of things. But yeah, Colette, what do you think?
Yeah, gosh, I totally agree with that. And that has definitely been our experience here, whether they're economic developers that are here and were impacted or those that came in to help. That was definitely an important role. I think another really important role that happened within those convenings is the ability for economic developers to look at recovery from a different perspective. Right. It's easy, I think, for government officials. There's a very specific lens through which they look at recovery, but economic developers look at it really differently. And that was very valuable to us as we were looking at the recovery. I think anytime an area experiences a disaster, there's some shock happening and no one really knows what to do. And you're searching for those things to start with, what to do. And so in those early days, having the economic developers come in and say, hey, have you thought about this? What about, what if you did a pop-up business district, to kind of get things started? So ideas like that really weren't considered prior to that really helped give some action, not only to the city, but also to the businesses, and gave them some hope that there are actions that can be taken. There are steps that can be made without having to have your whole building rebuilt. There are small steps that can be done in that time. And so I think that is a really valuable thing that economic developers can bring in those early days and then carry on throughout recovery.
Yeah, for sure. And being nimble and being able to pivot and depending on the situation, really important skills. Jesse, what are the more immediate steps an economic developer should take during a disaster to help businesses?
Yeah, I thought it'd be good kind of to share a couple stories that kind of help address that, because really the first thing that I think you can do immediately, the real first thing is to really define your purpose and then take action accordingly. And I think about that really in connection to two stories from my professional experience. The first was the Oroville Dam. There was a major kind of incident with the dam, and I was sent up there to help support the small business community. And I remember being asked to do that over a weekend, flying up there, I think on a Monday, and expecting to go into a community, a downtown area that was underwater, and being greeted by the business community saying, like, we're totally fine. Our downtown area is 100% open, ready for business, but we are not getting anybody here because the media is saying that we're underwater. And what we could really use is a PR campaign. And so when I was ready to bring in, pumps and other things, they were not asking for that. The second incident was when I went to work at the local assistance center in the Santa Rosa fires. And I remember thinking, I'm going to have to be working with wineries. I'm going to need to be working with maybe manufacturers. And the first gentleman that came to my table asking for support, he said to me, I have a small business, it's just me, where I provide water service to the local wineries here. And all of my inventory, my big plastic jugs, everything burnt in the fire. And I'm going to lose custody of my daughter because I can't make rent. And if I can't make rent, I can't, can retain custody. Can you help me, secure supplies to rebuild my business so that I can make rent? And I remember thinking, oh, I'm not ready for that. I'm not ready for this thing that actually doesn't have such a government purview. That's me negotiating on your behalf with your supplier, trying to get maybe a bank to give you a short-term loan so you can re-asset yourself. And just thinking, when you go into any kind of situation, you really got to get the lay of the land, right? You got to define what is your purpose that this community needs at the moment, and then take action accordingly. The next step from there is really to act with urgency, because folks' lives are on the line, their livelihoods are on the line. And so you need to really be mindful that time is of the essence. You don't have time to, wait around, try to find the perfect solution. You just need to start moving. So define your purpose and then taking action accordingly, acting with urgency. And then, like we said before, being that central resource for information, because people won't have access to their phones. They won't have, they're going to be really preoccupied with 1,000 different things. What are they going to do about their kids who can't go to school? How they're going to take care of their parents. So when they have a question, you need to be ready with that information, whatever that might be. So that means you need to become the expert in a lot of different things. You need to be talking to the other resource providers in the room. You need to understand what they're working on and be really able to kind of be that conduit information, and provide that at the ready, and then act as a convener when necessary. If somebody needs help in kind of aggregating resources, you be that person. And then always using data to drive decisions. What are you understanding from the field? What do the latest reports tell you? What do you know about the small business demographics of the area, so you can plan for that? Like, for example, in when the Malibu fires here, the small business community that was actually most impacted were the housekeepers, the gardeners who lived in South LA that take the buses to Malibu to work there. They were the ones that got the most immediate economic impact because they weren't able to go to those places and make a living. And that's a South LA community, not a Malibu community. So, a lot of that's just understanding, okay, what is the field data telling you? And then promoting resources in the way that makes sense for the community, multi-language, whatever method they prefer, whether that's radio or print, and just being ready to provide that, call at once. So just a few, probably too long of a list, Helen, but it's all in the playbook. I'll tell everybody this, it's all in the playbook. You can research it, but, I would just say kind of foremost is really assessing before you take action. Don't let go of all your assumptions, learn first, listen a whole lot, and then take action accordingly from there.
No, really great examples, Jesse. I mean, some things you just never would think about initially, the bus example of the workers commuting there. So, definitely check out full details in the playbook. A lot of good information. With all of that going on, for the economic developers, businesses, personal lives, so forth, how do you protect the mental health and well-being of your staff and yourself during disaster recovery?
Oh, Colette, I would love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, I was gonna say I definitely have thoughts on that for sure. That is a huge challenge. I think we found through the pandemic, we really realized that mental health is such a huge aspect of all of these things that we do. And we certainly saw that even before the pandemic and the campfire, where everyone in this community was impacted in some way. Most people were very, very acutely impacted. And then that sort of radiated out. But everyone really in the region has an impact from this disaster. The scope is very broad. And that was extremely challenging because most of the people, not only who were survivors, they were also the people doing the work for recovery, coming in and, trying to reopen their business, in the government, trying to help everything recover. And so dealing with that level of trauma personally is very challenging, but also there's the secondary trauma of when the survivors come in and are looking for help and services and are asking you, every single person wants to tell their story, right? And that's a necessary part of recovery. It's really difficult for that person listening to that story. And so having mental health services, not only for the wider population, but for those people, like you said, who are providing the services, the economic developers, the government officials, those people who are helping with the recovery, having mental health services for those people are so important. And, I think I'll say very honestly, I don't think we did a great job of that here because that wasn't really something we were thinking about at that point. But now looking back, that is something that we absolutely think was one of the most important things we should have been doing and something we should have been thinking about before the disaster. So that's something that we now see as part of that resiliency and part of looking forward into being resilient for future disasters is having mental health services available and ready for those people who are going to be experiencing those as a survivor or as just listening.
Yeah, I love the question. I love the information you share, Colette, but I also love the question because I don't think that kind of question would have been asked before. The trauma things and how do you deal with it. I remember during pandemic when now I have my own firm. I don't do a whole lot of direct small business interaction, but often my clients would actually refer small business owners to me. And I would get text messages at 11 o'clock at night, somebody saying, "Hey, can I just talk to you for a little bit? I got your name from somebody," and you would spend an hour with them and listen as they said, "I'm going to lose my business. I don't know what to do." And part of it is you don't have a solution. You're just there to listen and kind of be therapy or therapeutic. And also as an economic developer, I remember during pandemic where, doing incredible things in a short amount of time, standing up a grant program in a week with $40 million and having that money get spent down in 5 minutes and having a chamber who I've worked with for a long time call me and say, how could you do that to our small businesses and having to go for a long walk, just to kind of, so I always say, there's the things around just, as a employer myself, allowing time for your team, giving them space to digest, to take a break, understanding that they're going through traumatic experience as well. And just giving them the opportunity or the resources to help, maybe not say overcome it, but deal with it, transition through. And even on just a different level, I remember when we were there helping Santa Rosa, we didn't have a policy in place around things like how long should an employee of the state be in an area that is filled with smoke. And so just thinking through your policies and procedures, what exactly is your plan? How would you support your team in the event of some kind of long-term disaster? Do you have thoughts in place around rotation, right? What is the time schedules that is acceptable, especially knowing that it's not an 8-hour shift in an area that is impacted by disaster. It's a long time, and that you might need to think about maybe that's a 4-hour shift. So a lot of those kind of policies and procedures I think are really important. I would just say that probably pandemic has really helped us all think about that a little bit more closely, because sometimes when it's a fire or earthquake, the period of time, although it might be up to a year, it's a little bit more short term. A 3-year pandemic sure does make you think a little bit differently about policies and procedures.
Absolutely. I mean, it's just another level of support. I mean, you can have financial assistance and other tips for businesses, but it's just another level of support and being there for your community. Really great information, and very important, Colette, like you mentioned, to consider for future disasters and for communities to definitely include in their resiliency plan. All right, what advice and resources can you share to assist businesses with preparing for economic disruptions?
Yeah, happy to go first, and of course, I have to first tout a program that I personally assisted with in collaboration with CALED and the Academy for Economic Development, which is the Outsmart Disaster Program, which was one of the first projects that I got involved with, actually when I started my firm, and just before the pandemic hit. And Outsmart Disaster is a program, a state-operated program, now housed with the California Office of Small Business Advocate. That's really essentially meant to help provide some immediate information and resources around how you can become resilient, prepared for disasters of all type. And the origin comes from helping people get prepared for earthquakes, but now has since evolved to really kind of address any types of disasters. So it's just a really great walkthrough that kind of puts you through the steps of preparedness based off of the national framework around preparedness. It just helps you think about things like, okay, what is critical to your business operation? What are those things that matter most to you? What is a likely disaster that would impact you, given where you live, where your business is, recent events, that kind of thing. And then what exactly would your response be to that? And how would you respond if there's different levels of severity? And it just really kind of provides you the great toolkit, templates, resources, ideas, thoughts around how you would actually kind of maneuver through a disaster of any type. The best way to get more information about it is to go onto the California Office of Small Business Advocate website. The URL is outsmartdisaster.calosba.ca.gov, but I'm sure those links will be shared in the show notes. But it's a great, easy, free to use, walkthrough, powerful tool designed by the best in the business. And it was a pleasure being part of that campaign. And just other resources I would just share, and you can also find these on the CalOSBA site, as well as that. California is blessed in that we have a number of major federal and state and local funded technical assistance programs. Technical assistance meaning free one-on-one consulting or low cost or no cost training for small business owners. Major programs across the state like the Small Business Development Centers, the Women's Business Centers, Procurement Technical Assistance Centers. All these folks have a mandate to provide assistance, especially when it comes to disaster. You can sign up for free. And get assigned to an advisor who will work with you one-on-one on any kind of issue you have, whether it's disaster related or not. So I would just encourage you, your tax dollars have paid for it already. So I encourage you to use that. It's a free service. Again, you can find all that information on the CalOSBA website as well.
Well, great. I mean, that was a fantastic list of resources, Jesse. I'm so glad you went through those. And I just would like to add, in our experience here, a lot of our businesses are using some of those resources, especially the Outsmart Disaster. That is such a fantastic program. I can't say enough, how wonderful that is, and something that I think will serve businesses so well in the future. And a lot of our businesses here are also kind of doing an add-on to their business plan, which is a resiliency plan. So making that part of their business plan, they're working with the Small Business Development Center that are, available locally to do that, to add that on to their business plan is something that they're thinking through to that level, because that's really the level of thinking that businesses realize. Post campfire, they think, gosh, I wish I would have thought through some of these things. And so that is really what we recommend quite a bit, is to think about that as an add-on to your business plan. I also want to mention that as businesses are thinking through that type of planning, there are other resources available for some of that data that Jesse was talking about, thinking about what hazards are happening in your community and how you might respond to those. Every county, and depending on how big your city is, your city might have its own, has a local hazard mitigation plan that you can find normally on your county or city website. And that's a plan that's updated every 5 years. And it has all of that information available about identifying what those hazards are, what the severity can be, and how the government is going to react to those. So that's great information for any business to look at to determine what are the hazards I should be prepared for, because sometimes they're obvious and sometimes they're not as obvious. So it can be really helpful to look through that and think through what that's going to be. I think now all of the local hazard mitigation plans include global pandemic as one of the available options, which probably wasn't included very much before. So they change very often, but I would encourage anyone to take a look at those types of plans as well to help inform their decision making.
I just want to give a shout out to that tip. Where I live, the city of South Pasadena, they have a great local hazard mitigation plan, which included high winds, which I didn't realize was a big issue, but apparently is. So yes, highly recommend. The only thing I would also suggest is that often cybersecurity doesn't get included in those plans the way it should. And as we all unfortunately saw from the pandemic, ransomware attacks became really prevalent, especially as people were pivoting to more virtual models for their business. So in case that's not included in your local hazard mitigation or just isn't on your radar, cyber attack is a thing and should be considered. So yeah, and also if you need resources around cyber, how do you respond to cyber? The U.S. Small Business Administration does a lot of great work around providing easy-to-use material tools around cyber attack.
Yeah, great resources. And further details, of course, are provided in the full playbook. So we encourage you to check that out. Finally, I'd like to close off with asking, as an economic development professional, how would you recommend using the playbook?
I'll go first. I think like I've said previously, I think one of the most important things that I learned in going through disasters, especially many different sizes of disasters, right? Some of them have been small, some of them have been very large, is the thinking that we did beforehand was so important. And when, hindsight, looking back saying, I wish we would have thought about that. And so I think the best way to use the playbook is before a disaster happens. At least, that's from my perspective. And in writing the chapter that I contributed to, that really was the lens that I was hoping to get across, is that is the best time to think through these things, to come up with a resiliency plan, to forge those relationships with your city, with the public works team, specifically for infrastructure, but for any plans that you're making to do beforehand. It's super useful after the disaster as well, but beforehand, I think is the way I would use it if I hadn't been through the disasters I'd been through. That's what I would do.
Oh yeah, 100% agree with you, Colette. Just on a more tactical side, because it's such a great playbook, because the team really did a great job of really trying to think about all the different aspects as relates to recovery and including it into one thing. So looking first at, let's say, the table of contents to really see which section will speak most to whatever your need is or what you're planning for, I think goes a long way. And I also really loved all the case studies, because it's one thing to see the description or, kind of the suggested procedures or, suggested thoughts, but then to see the case studies and to see it in action or kind of the further examples of how things could be deployed is really helpful. And then also just, behind every great book, there's always people. And so just getting to learn more about who these folks are, who these experts were, and knowing that you have them as a resource too, if you ever need to have any additional thought or conversation. One thing I'll just say, the only glimmer of, silver lining around disaster is that there's a strong community of people in disaster work. And once you're in there kind of for life. And they are some of the most gracious and welcoming and thoughtful folks that you could ever connect with, who want to help you think through the best plan of action for your community. So I just encourage you to reach out and form those connections.
Yes, I second that.
Well, I'd like to thank both of you, Colette and Jesse, for your insight and expertise on this important topic, not only on the podcast today, but for your contributions on the playbook and your work in the field. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Helen. It's such an honor to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. It was a pleasure.
And we appreciate all of you that took the time to join us on this podcast today. Please remember to download a copy of the full playbook to learn more valuable tips and information to help your community's businesses become more resilient to economic disruptions. Thank you.